Welcome back, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive back to 1896, the very first modern Olympic Games in Athens. We're talking newspaper clippings, first-hand accounts, even some scholarly analysis to, really try to get a feel for this pivotal moment in sporting history.
I think what's so fascinating about the 1896 games, they weren't just JST about athletic competition. They were a reflection of a world in transition, grappling with ideas of nationalism, internationalism, and even the very definition of sport itself.
That's what we're here to uncover. Okay, so before we get to Athens in 1896, we need to rewind a bit further. I know the ancient Olympics were a huge deal for over 1,000 years, but remind us, why were they ultimately abolished?
Well, as you said, the ancient Olympics. Held in Olympia, they were deeply intertwined with religion and Greek culture, honoring Zeus, and for centuries, they were a symbol of unity among the Greek city-states. But by the 4th century, CE, the Roman Empire had embraced Christianity, and those pagan rituals were seen as a threat. And so in 393 CE, Roman Emperor Theodosius I officially abolished the games.
So imagine, for over 1,500 years, the Olympics were just a memory, a whisper of a glorious past. And then comes Pierre de Coubertin, this French educator and historian with a vision. He saw the potential of sport, not just for physical fitness.
For something much grander, right?
Exactly. Coubertin was deeply passionate about the idea of sport as a unifying force,
Yeah.
a way to promote peace and understanding between nations. He believed that athletic competition could transcend those political and cultural divides, and reviving the Olympic Games, he thought that was the perfect way to do it. This wasn't just about bringing back athletic competition. It was about reviving an ancient ideal and using it to try to shape a more peaceful future. So Coubertin establishes the International Olympic Committee in 1894, and the race to host the first modern games is on. And who better to take up that challenge than Greece, the birthplace of the Olympics?
It seems like the obvious choice. But Greece, in the late 1800s, was facing some pretty serious challenges, both economically and politically. Hosting a global event like the Olympics, that was a huge undertaking, and some were skeptical they could pull it off.
I can imagine the pressure to have this ancient tradition reborn on your soil, but not have the resources to really do it justice.
It was, but thankfully they had champions in King George I and Crown Prince Constantine, who were really instrumental in garnering both public and financial support. They understood the significance of bringing the games back to their birthplace, and they were determined to make it a success.
It's amazing how certain individuals can really rally a nation around a shared goal.
Yeah.
But even with royal support, they still needed a lot of help to make this happen, right? Tell me about Georgios Averof.
Averof! He was a wealthy Greek businessman and philanthropist living in Alexandria, Egypt. When he heard about the struggles to fund the games, he stepped up in a big way, donated a massive sum of money, over 9 million drachmas at the time, to restore the Panathenaic Stadium.
This wasn't just any stadium. It was the ancient marble stadium, built over 2,000 years ago. To think that athletes in 1896 were competing in the same space as those ancient Olympians.
Absolutely. Averof's contribution was essential. Without him, the games might have looked very different. And talk about symbolism. The opening ceremony was held on April 6, 1896, which was also Greek Independence Day. It was a powerful statement, intertwining that national pride with this global event.
Wow, you've painted such a vivid picture. I can almost hear the roar of the crowd, the music, the sense of anticipation in the air. Can you describe that opening ceremony for us? What would it have felt like to be there?
Imagine 80,000 people packed into that Panathenaic Stadium, the Greek flag waving proudly, the Philharmonic Orchestra playing, and then the athletes entering the stadium, representing 14 nations from around the world. It was a spectacle, a true fusion of ancient and modern, a celebration of both Greek heritage and this new era of international sport.
And remember, this was a world without television, without the internet. For most people, the news of the games would have spread through word of mouth. Newspapers, maybe the occasional photograph. It must have felt so much more immediate, so much more personal.
That's what makes those early games so compelling. They weren't yet a media extravaganza. They were about the athletes, the competition, and the raw emotions of those present. You were experiencing history in real time, and that must have been exhilarating.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The athletes themselves. We all know the legendary stories of Olympians pushing boundaries and achieving greatness. But in 1896, who were these competitors? Were they professional athletes as we think of them today?
Not quite. This was still the era of amateurism, with a strong emphasis on the purity of sport. The idea that athletes should compete for the love of the game. not for financial gain. But even back then, that line was starting to blur. Take Carl Schumann, for example. He was a German gymnast, won 4 gold medals in Athens, competing in events like the vault, parallel bars, and even wrestling.
4 gold medals.
Mhm.
It seems like these early games really celebrated athletes who were well-rounded, able to compete across different disciplines.
It's true. Specialization came later as the games evolved, and the number of events grew. But Schumann's success raises interesting questions about that ideal of amateurism. He was a locksmith by trade. But to reach that level of skill in multiple sports must have required an immense amount of time and dedication.
It makes you wonder how amateur these athletes truly were. Could someone like Schumann with a regular job really compete on equal footing with those who has the luxury of training full-time?
It's a debate that was already simmering in 1896, and it continues to this day, especially as the lines between amateur and professional athletes become increasingly blurred.
It speaks to the evolving nature of the games and how they reflect broader social and economic realities. Speaking of evolving, let's talk about another issue that's central to the Olympic story, the inclusion of women.
Yes, this is a critical part of the narrative. In 1896, Coubertin and many others at the time held the belief that women's participation in athletics was inappropriate, even unfeminine.
It's hard to imagine the games without women competing today, but back then their absence was a reflection of deeply ingrained societal norms.
It was, and it would take decades of advocacy and activism for women to finally gain a foothold in the Olympic movement. The 1896 Games, while groundbreaking in many ways, also highlight those early barriers to equality in sport.
It's a reminder that the Olympics, even from their very inception, have always been intertwined with social and political issues. They're not just about athletic feats. They're a microcosm of the world at large.
Exactly, and that's why they continue to captivate us. The Games are a stage where human drama unfolds, where individual stories intersect with broader historical narratives.
Speaking of stories, let's get back to the athletes who made history in Athens. The marathon, of course, holds a special place in Olympic lore. And the winner of that very first marathon was a Greek water carrier named Spyridon.
His victory was a fairy tale, a true embodiment of the Olympic spirit. Here was this ordinary man, not a professional athlete in the modern sense, who achieved greatness on the world stage.
It's almost like something out of a myth, isn't it? Especially considering the marathon's connection to ancient Greek history.
The legend of Phidippides, the messenger who ran from Marathon to Athens to announce a Greek victory over the Persians, played a huge role in shaping the marathon's significance. And Louis's victory, in the very first modern games held in Greece, amplified that symbolism tenfold.
But what's interesting is that the marathon distance we know today, 26.2 miles, wasn't actually standardized until later. In 1896, the race was about 25 miles.
That's right. And the distance was later changed for the 1908 London Games because, legend has it, the British royal family wanted the race to start at Windsor Castle and finish in front of the royal box at the White City Stadium.
So the marathon distance we take for granted today is actually a result of royal preference. It's these little historical quirks that make exploring the past so fascinating.
Absolutely. And it shows how even seemingly fixed aspects of the games have evolved and been shaped by various influences over time.
Lou's victory was obviously a defining moment for Greece, but there were other inspiring stories from those games. Tell me about James Connolly, the American who won the triple jump.
Connolly's story is a testament to determination and a bit of rule bending. He was a student at Harvard, but decided to compete in Athens. Despite the fact that his university didn't officially sanction his participation, he actually left school without permission to pursue his Olympic dream.
And that leap of faith paid off. He became the first champion of the modern games, winning the triple jump with a distance of just over 45 feet.
It was a historic moment, and Connolly's name will forever be etched in Olympic history. His victory also highlighted the growing international appeal of the Games. Athletes from across the globe were willing to make incredible sacrifices to be a part of this historic event.
It's clear that the individual athletes played a huge role in capturing the public's imagination. But what about the experience of the spectators? What would it have been like to actually be in Athens, witnessing these historic events unfold?
Imagine a world without instant replays, without social media, without the constant bombardment of information we experience today. The 1896 Games were a much more intimate affair, experienced primarily through the senses.
You'd be relying on your own eyes to follow the action, the roar of the crowd to gauge the excitement, the murmurs of fellow spectators to understand the significance of each event.
Exactly. There's a certain magic in that shared experience, a direct connection to the raw emotions of the moment. You're witnessing history unfold right before your eyes, without the filter of technology or media interpretation.
But I imagine the atmosphere in Athens must have been electric. Greece, a nation steeped in history and tradition, welcoming the world to this grand revival of the ancient games.
The sense of national pride was palpable. The games were seen as a symbol of Greece's resilience, a testament to their cultural heritage. They were a chance to showcase their history, their spirit, and their place on the world stage.
And for the world, it was a chance to reconnect with those ancient ideals. The pursuit of excellence, the spirit of competition, the unifying power of sport. It's almost as if, for a brief moment, the world had come together to celebrate something larger than themselves.
That's the essence of the Olympic ideal, isn't it? To transcend national boundaries, to find common ground in the spirit of sport, to strive for greatness together. And while the 1896 Games were just the beginning of that journey, they laid the foundation for something truly extraordinary.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking about how those early spectators would react to the Olympics today. Would they even recognize the event that's grown into this global spectacle, with billions of viewers, massive corporate sponsorships, and a level of athleticism that was unimaginable back then?
It's a fascinating question. On one hand, they'd likely be overwhelmed by the sheer scale and technological advancements. But on the other hand, I believe they'd still recognize the heart of the games, the passion of the athletes, the thrill of the competition, and that enduring spirit that transcends time and borders.
The human desire to push limits, strive for excellence, to test ourselves against the best in the world. Those are timeless qualities.
Exactly. The Olympics, at their core, are a celebration of human potential. And that's something that resonates across generations, no matter how much the world around us changes.
So while we may marvel at the differences between those early games and the Olympics of today, it's important to remember those fundamental connections, those threads that weave a continuous narrative through history.
And that's what makes exploring the past so rewarding. We gain a deeper understanding of not just where we came from, but also where we might be headed. The 1896 Games weren't just a starting point. They were a springboard for a movement that continues to shape our world.
Well said. But we've only just scratched the surface of this fascinating story. There's so much more to uncover about the legacy of those first games, how they influence the events we know today, and the challenges that lay ahead for the Olympic movement.
And that's what makes this deep dive so exciting. By looking back at the 1896 Games, we gain a clearer perspective on the complexities and contradictions of the modern Olympic movement.
It's like holding a mirror up to ourselves, isn't it? We see our own aspirations reflected in those early games, but we also see how far we've come in terms of addressing issues like equality, fairness, and the commercialization of sport.
Precisely. And as we move forward, it's essential to grapple with those legacies, positive and negative, to ensure that the Olympic ideal continues to evolve and adapt to the challenges of our time.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the 1896 Games, what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners will ponder? What's the lasting significance of those first games?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's crucial to recognize the 1896 Games as a moment of remarkable innovation and vision. Pierre de Coubertin and those who supported his dream dared to imagine a world where sport could transcend national boundaries and promote peace.
It was a bold idea, and even though the world of 1896 was vastly different from our own, that core belief in the unifying power of sport still resonates today.
Absolutely. And while the Games have faced their share of challenges and controversies over the years, that underlying spirit of international cooperation and striving for excellence is something worth cherishing and protecting.
It's also important to acknowledge that the 1896 Games were a product of their time. With limitations and exclusions that we might find troubling today, the absence of women, the emphasis on amateurism that often favored the wealthy, these are aspects we can't ignore.
It's true. And those shortcomings highlight the need for ongoing dialogue and critical reflection. The Olympics must continuously evolve to ensure they reflect our values of inclusivity, equality, and fairness.
And that evolution requires active participation, not just from athletes and organizers, but from all of us. As viewers, as fans, as citizens, we have a responsibility to engage with the Olympic movement, to challenge its shortcomings, and to celebrate its triumphs.
Well said. The Olympics belong to everyone, and their future depends on our collective commitment to upholding the ideals they represent.
So as we look back on those pioneering athletes who gathered in Athens over a century ago, Let's honor their legacy by striving to create a future where the Olympic Games truly embody the best of humanity.
A future where sport continues to inspire and to push the boundaries of human potential.
I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much for taking us on this incredible journey back to the 1896 Games.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and inspired you to think critically about the role of sport in our world. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep that Olympic spirit alive.